On a dusty December morning in 1920, in a village so poor that children counted the holes in their only pair of shorts, a baby was born who would one day control a budget larger than the wealth of every family he knew combined. That boy, who came into the world in Michael Okpara with nothing but his name and his mother's trembling hands, would grow up to sign documents that moved millions, redraw maps, and decide who ate and who starved. Yet on the night he was born, the only light over his head was a flickering palm oil lamp, and the only sound outside was the cough of a dying world under colonial rule. Michael Okpara did not arrive into comfort. His father worked small patches of land, scraping life from tired soil, measuring seasons not by dates, but by whether yams had survived the last flood. His mother counted coins one by one before walking new miles each week to the market, praying that the prices had not fallen again. The house was mud, the roof was thatch, and the rain did not knock politely. It pushed through the roof, dripped into pots, and soaked the mat where children slept. In such a place, dreams were dangerous things. They could cost you strength you needed just to stay alive. By the time Michael could walk, he had already learned the sound of hunger. It wasn't just a rumbling stomach. It was the quiet in the evening when grown men spoke less because they knew there would not be enough for everyone. It was the way mothers cut slices of yam thinner and thinner, trying to stretch the meal until it looked like plenty. In the 1920s and 1930s in villages like his, it was not unusual for 1 in every 5 children to die before they turned 5. These were the odds that hung over his cradle. Every fever could be the last. Every cough could be final. He watched his father's hands, hardened and cracked, and thought they looked like tree roots. Those hands worked all day, yet the family barely stayed above hunger. When colonial officers passed through the area, it was like watching another species walk the earth. Their pressed shirts and polished boots gleamed against the red dust. Their orders were translated by local interpreters in trembling voices. A line of men would appear as if from nowhere, shoulders bowed, ready to carry their loads or pay new taxes. For a boy with sharp eyes, the contrast sank deep. Some men commanded with their voices, others with their silence. The church brought another kind of power. Missionaries arrived with Bibles and schoolbooks, speaking of salvation and education in the same breath. In the small mission school where he first sat on a rough bench, Michael stared in awe at paper filled with strange black marks that somehow carried meaning. The world opened, letter by letter. He learned to shape sounds into words, words into sentences, and sentences into questions that made adults uneasy. Why was one man sir and another boy, even when the boy was old enough to be his father? Why did white men sit while black men stood? Why did his people work the land but own so little of it? In school, he met the first person who would become his rival. The boy's name was Cheeky, the son of a relatively wealthy trader. Where Michael's clothes were clean but mended, Cheeks were new and crisp. Where Michael brought a small piece of yam for lunch, Cheeky brought bread wrapped in paper. They both discovered, almost at the same time, that they loved the feel of answers on their tongues. In class, their hands were always the first to shoot up. Teachers quickly noticed the tension. Every question was a duel, and every correct answer was a victory. The rivalry started as a game, but soon became something sharper, fueled by the unspoken knowledge that, in a world of few opportunities, only a handful of boys would climb out of the village into power. As Michael grew older, he realized that education was not just a path out. It was a countdown clock. Scholarships were few, and they went to those who outperformed everyone else decisively. At home, his parents said little, but their eyes told him everything. They could not pay for higher schooling. If he failed to win a scholarship, time would run out on his dreams, and the farm would claim him forever. Every exam was a test not just of knowledge, but of fate. And every exam also meant facing Chaiki, who studied in a well-lit room with plenty of food and parents who could pay for extra books. They both left the village for secondary school, entering a world that felt like another country. The buildings were larger, the rules stricter, the competition terrifying. In the corridors, older boys spoke English with an ease that made newcomers feel stupid. For the first time in his life, Michael felt small. Late at night, under the weak light of a kerosene lamp, he read until the letters blurred. He knew the numbers too well. The school only recommended a limited number of students for advanced training and colonial scholarships. Beyond that were rarer than rain in the dry season. It was there, in that small pressure cooker world, that something inside him hardened. One evening, after a test in which he had come second to Cheeky by a single point, Michael sat behind the dormitory, hands clenched. To others, second place looked like success. To him, it looked like a death sentence with delayed effect. He counted the years until the final exams, each one a step toward either release or imprisonment in poverty. At 16, he made a decision that surprised even himself. He would not just compete with Cheeky. He would outrun him so completely that there would be no question, no debate, no room for error. Around this time, he began to notice another kind of rivalry, bigger, colder, and more dangerous. It was the rivalry between those who governed and those who were governed. At school assemblies, colonial inspectors spoke of progress and civilization, yet when he went home for holidays, he saw roads that turned into rivers of mud during the rains, mothers giving birth without medical help, and children dying of diseases that could be cured with a few tablets. The difference between the speeches and the reality was not a crack. It was a canyon. He started to feel, without yet knowing the words, that this too was competition, a struggle over whose vision of the future would prevail. When missionaries spoke about medicine, his imagination caught fire. A doctor, he realized, had a kind of power that did not depend on race or accent. Disease, at least, did not bow to the white man. A skilled hand could pull a child back from the edge of death, and no colonial officer could deny the evidence when a fever broke and a life was saved. In those years, he began to dream of becoming a doctor, of returning to villages like his, with tools more effective than prayers. The idea gripped him so fiercely that it became almost an obsession. He would not just leave the farm. He would come back with the power to fight the thing that had stalked his childhood, preventable suffering. But the road to medicine was narrow, and again, time was running out. There were age limits for certain competitive exams. Miss them, and the door shut forever. One year, an outbreak of disease disrupted the school term, and exams were postponed. For many students, it meant extra time to read. For Michael, it felt like a cruel trick. Every delay threatened to push him closer to the age ceiling. He studied with a frenzy that worried his classmates. Even Chike, still the polished rival, once remarked, half mocking, half admiring, "If you keep going like this, Okpara, you'll study yourself into illness before you ever treat a patient." He passed the crucial exams. Letters arrived stiff with official stamps and promises. When he opened the envelope that confirmed his acceptance into medical training, he did not shout. He simply sat down, paper in hand, and stared at the doorway. He could see his mother there, just as she had been on the day he left for school, holding onto the wooden frame as if it could stop him from walking into the unknown. His father's eyes had been watery but proud, shadowed by the fear that their son might be lost to a world they did not understand. Now the path was open, but it led far from them. In medical school, the rivalry with Chike took on a new dimension. They were no longer just boys fighting for grades. They were young men inching toward professions that would define their lives. Chike, who had veered toward law and the colonial administration, began to present himself as a future bridge between rulers and ruled. He believed in change from within the system, gradual and polite. Michael found himself recoiling from that language. The more he saw of colonial hospitals, where African patients waited in endless lines while Europeans were ushered past, the more he felt that something deeper was wrong. A system built on inequality could not heal, no matter how many kind individuals worked inside it. The first real twist came in a crowded hospital ward. He was assisting when a child was brought in, burning with fever, eyes glassy, breathing shallowly. The mother's hands trembled as she held onto the edge of the bed, whispering to no one in particular that her son was all she had. Tests were delayed, supplies were short. A senior doctor barked orders, glanced at the chart, and moved on. Hours slipped away. By the time the medicine finally arrived, the child's chest had fallen still. In the silence that followed, a terrible number rose in Michael's mind. The number of children in his own village who had probably died in the same way years before for lack of attention, not lack of knowledge. Something broke inside him that day. It was not his compassion, that, if anything, intensified, but his belief that being a good doctor alone would be enough. He began to see disease not just as a medical problem, but as a political one. Why were there not enough drugs? Why were hospitals so few and far between? Why were budgets decided in distant rooms where people like his parents had no voice? For the first time, the idea of politics, which he had once dismissed as the chatter of distant men in suits, began to press on his mind like a fever of its own. Outside the hospital, the world was changing fast. Nationalist movements were rising. Newspapers printed fiery editorials calling for self-government. Students whispered about protests and meetings, some held in secret, some openly defiant. In back rooms and under trees, men debated strategies, petitions or strikes, speeches or marches. The British Empire, which had once seemed immovable, now showed cracks. Every headline about another colony demanding freedom added fuel to conversations in dormitories and lecture halls. Each year, the question grew louder. When would Nigeria's time come? In that swirling atmosphere, another rivalry began to form, more dangerous than the old competition with Chike. It was not just about personal success anymore. It was about visions of the future. Some, like Chike, argued that Nigerians should prove they were ready by cooperating, building careers inside the colonial system, and pushing gently for reforms. Others believed that only bold, organized political action would break the chains of dependency. Michael stood somewhere in between at first, torn between his medical calling and the voices, especially from the eastern region, demanding leaders who understood the suffering of the villages. The turning point came when he was invited to a small political meeting, more out of curiosity than conviction. The room was hot, crowded with men who spoke with burning intensity about land, taxes, and the humiliation of being treated as perpetual minors in their own country. On the wall hung a rough map of Nigeria. Someone pointed at the eastern region, his home, and spoke of its richness in people and resources, and its poverty in infrastructure and opportunity. Michael listened, his heart pounding, as he realized that the problems he had been fighting one patient at a time were symptoms of a larger disease. At that meeting, a man stood up and said something that struck him like a blow. If we keep curing the sick in a sick system, we are only delaying their suffering. We must treat the system itself. It was a sentence that refused to leave his mind. Days later, he sat across from Cheek in a noisy canteen. Both of them older now, faces leaner, ambitions sharper. Cheeky spoke excitedly about a promising position he might secure, a step into the administration. From there, he said, I can influence policy. That's real power. Michael, stirring his food, realized that their rivalry was no longer confined to classrooms. It had become ideological, a battle over what kind of man each would become. Time once again pressed in like a closing door. Elections were being discussed. Parties were forming, splitting, and merging. Leaders were emerging from the shadows, many of them older, with long histories of activism. Michael was young, still building his medical reputation. Some of his colleagues told him to wait, to focus on his career, to join politics later, when he had more experience. But later was a dangerous word in a colony on the brink of transformation. If he waited too long, decisions about the future of his people would be made without him. If he jumped too soon, he might lose everything he had struggled for: the career, the respect, the ability to support his family. In the space of a few months, his schedule became almost impossible. By day, he treated patients, raced through ward rounds, and tried to keep up with the demands of his profession. By night, he attended meetings, listened to elders in the nationalist movement, and began to speak himself, at first hesitantly, then with growing confidence. It was like living two lives on parallel tracks that were about to collide. Sleep became a luxury. His body grew leaner, his eyes more intense. He knew something would have to give, and soon. One evening, after a particularly draining day at the hospital, he received an invitation that forced his internal conflict into the open. A political party, eager to strengthen its base in the eastern region, wanted him to stand as a candidate in an upcoming election. The timeline was brutal. He had only weeks to decide, to campaign, to face the electorate, and to risk public failure. If he accepted, Cheeky warned him, half seriously, half tauntingly, you might end up as just another loud voice with no patience, no practice, and no future. If he refused, he knew the chance might never come again. The clock began to tick loudly in his mind, not in seconds, but in days left until nomination closed. As he walked home that night, the streets around him alive with the murmurs of a people slowly awakening, he knew that the boy who had once studied by a dim lamp in a mud house had reached another impossible crossroads. The stakes were no longer just his own escape from poverty, but the direction of a region, and soon a nation, that stood on the edge of history. In front of him lay two paths: the predictable, hard-won security of a respected doctor, and the dangerous, uncertain road of politics. Nay, where rivals like Cheeky would not just challenge his grades, but his very right to speak for others. The deadline for his decision was close, and the world around him was changing faster than any exam he had ever faced. Years later, people would point to photographs of Michael Okpara in a crisp white agbada, walking past saluting policemen, and think he had always belonged in corridors of power. They didn't see the moment when he stood alone in the half-dark, still smelling of disinfectant and hospital sweat, holding a thin paper that could ruin everything he had worked for. In less than 10 years, he would sign laws that shaped the lives of millions. On that night, he was just a tired doctor with 48 hours to decide whether to gamble his entire future on an election he might well lose. The invitation lay on his table like a live coal. Stand for election, leave the safety of the hospital, step into a world of shouting crowds, ruthless rivals, and public judgment. He knew exactly how many pounds he earned each month as a doctor, how many relatives depended on him, how fragile that hard-won security was. Politics promised nothing but uncertainty. Yet outside his window, the city hummed with a new kind of restlessness. Newspapers screamed about constitutional conferences in London. The word independence was no longer a distant dream. It had a date attached, whispered in markets and offices. History was moving on a timetable. If he didn't jump in now, he might spend the rest of his life watching other men mismanage the future he had imagined. He tried to sleep that night and failed. Faces floated before his eyes. The child who had died for lack of medicine, the mother staring at an empty bed, his father bent over. Dry soil, his classmates who had drifted into comfortable jobs and quiet compromises. Somewhere among them, like a recurring shadow, stood Cheeky, the boy who had once beaten him by a single point, now worked comfortably within the colonial administration, already being groomed for higher office. While Michael wrestled with conscience and fear, Cheek had access to files, information, and people who whispered about influence, as calmly as they ordered tea. The rivalry that had once been about marks on a paper was now about something far more terrifying. Who would shape the rules of a country not yet born? At dawn, with the sky still bruised from night, Michael made his decision. He would stand for office. The relief was sharp but brief. Instantly, it was replaced by the cold realization of what that meant. He had less than 3 weeks before the party's internal deadline for selecting candidates. 3 weeks to convince party elders who barely knew him. 3 weeks to introduce himself to voters who did not care that he was top of his class in medical school. They wanted to know, could he bring roads, jobs, clinics? Could he stand up to the colonial officers? Could he, a young man in his 20s, be trusted with their hopes? He entered politics the way he had entered medicine, by throwing himself in with a kind of controlled desperation. By day, he still worked at the hospital. People did not stop getting sick because he had discovered politics. He stitched wounds, listened to labored breathing, and signed charts with fingers that trembled from lack of sleep, more than from uncertainty. At dusk, he changed into a simple tunic and stepped into another world. Village squares lit by hurricane lamps. Schoolyards turned into meeting grounds. Palm wine bars, where people argued about taxes, land, and rumors of coming self-government. The same hands that had learned to hold a scalpel now gripped makeshift podiums as he spoke into the night. He was not a natural orator at first. His voice lacked the smooth, rolling thunder of older politicians who had been speaking at rallies since he was a schoolboy. But he had something else. Stories. He spoke of the wards he had seen, of patients traveling for days to reach a clinic, of children dying of diseases that could be cured, with drugs cheaper than a pair of imported shoes. He painted pictures so sharp that people stopped shifting on their benches and leaned forward. "You think politics is distant," he would say. "But politics decides whether your wife gives birth in a clean room or on a dirty mat. Politics decides whether your child walks 5 miles to school or doesn't go at all." His words didn't soar, they cut. The first twist came sooner than he expected. One humid afternoon as he left the hospital, he saw a familiar figure waiting by the gate, suit crisp, briefcase in hand. Cheeky. They had not met in months. The rival greeted him with a wide smile that did not reach his eyes. "Dr. Okpara," he began, savoring the title. "I hear you've decided to trade your stethoscope for slogans." He said it lightly, but the real message followed quickly. The party inviting Michael to run had a strong base in the region, but it was not the only game in town. Another party, supported quietly by powerful men in the colonial administration, was desperate to win the same seat. Their proposed candidate, Cheeky mentioned casually, had years of experience, connections, and friends in high places. "You're a good man," Cheek said, lowering his voice. "But politics is not an exam you can pass by working hard. There are people who won't let you win, no matter how many nights you sacrifice. Some of my colleagues think you might split the vote. They are already concerned." The warning was clear. Enter this arena, and you will not just face the voters. You will face us. Michael walked away from that conversation with anger coiled in his chest like a spring. The old rivalry had mutated. It was no longer about who could answer faster in class. It was about who would be allowed to stand at the microphone when the future was being negotiated. Yet the more he thought of backing down, the more he saw the faces of his patients. If he surrendered before the fight began, what right would he ever again have to complain about bad policies? As the internal party selection drew closer, the pressure intensified. Older politicians, suspicious of his youth, tested him with brutal questions. Could he withstand attacks? Was he willing to leave his practice entirely if necessary? Would he obey party discipline? Or was he another educated young man who thought he knew better than everyone else? Behind polite inquiries lurked another fear, that this doctor, with his sharp mind and stubborn streak, might grow too powerful too quickly. There was another crueler clock ticking in the background, his hospital contract. Administrators wanted to know whether he would renew for another term. The deadline for his decision fell just days after the party would announce its candidate. If he lost the internal contest, he could still retreat to medicine, if he had not already burned too many bridges. If he won, he would almost certainly have to give up the contract and step into the void. It was a countdown with no pause button. Every hour of those days felt heavy. The selection meeting itself was a drama of sweat and whispers. In a crowded hall thick with tobacco smoke, party delegates sat on wooden benches, sorting through rumors like cards. Some had been approached by rival factions. Offers had been made. Money, future favors, promises of contracts and appointments. As Michael took the floor to speak, he knew that few in that room cared about his grades or the depth of his medical knowledge. He had to convince them that he could win, that he could stand on a platform in front of thousands and pull them out to vote. He spoke without notes. He talked about his childhood village, about the taste of thin yam slices in times of hunger, about his father's cracked hands and his mother's quiet determination. He described walking into wards where 3 patients shared a bed, and the stench of preventable death hung in the air. Then he did something unexpected. He spoke about time. The British have already set their timetable, he said. Conferences have dates. Independence has dates. Budgets have dates. While we argue about who should stand and who should sit, their ships are already loading. In a few years, they will leave. They will leave whether we are ready or not. The question is, when that day comes, will we stand here as bystanders, or will we already have leaders trained, tested, and ready? When he finished, the room was quiet. Then the murmurs began. Hours later, after secret ballots and tense counting, his name was announced as the party's candidate. He felt no urge to celebrate. Immediately, the pressure doubled. The internal battle was over. The real war had just begun. The election campaign that followed was more brutal than any exam he had ever taken. His opponents, including indirectly those aligned with Chike, wasted no time in attacking him. They painted him as an inexperienced dreamer, a man who wanted to experiment on the future as he had experimented with medicine at the bedside. Pamphlets appeared, printed on cheap paper, accusing him of being out of touch with rural life because he had spent years in hospitals. Rumors spread that he planned to abandon the region once he won, to seek a high position in Lagos or even London. Anonymous voices on market corners asked why a doctor would leave a respected profession unless he was chasing money and power. Michael responded the only way he knew how. He went directly to the people. He walked. He rode in rattling lorries. He crossed muddy paths on motorbikes that sputtered and threatened to die beneath him. He visited villages that politicians rarely bothered with, where meetings were held under mango trees and elders sat on low stools, measuring each word that fell from his lips. He didn't promise miracles. Instead, he laid out simple, concrete images. Dispensaries where mothers could get medicine without traveling 2 days, farm support, programs that meant more than slogans, schools where children would learn little more than he had in his first mission classroom, but in greater numbers. Still, it almost wasn't enough. On Election Day, tension crackled like static in the air. The turnout was massive, fueled by a mixture of hope, fear, and carefully fanned rivalries. Ballot papers were counted by lantern light in some stations, watched closely by party agents who suspected each other of every trick in the book. In one town, a sudden fire broke out in a nearby market just as counting was about to begin, pulling people away, casting suspicion over the whole process. Whispers spread. Was it an accident or a deliberate distraction? By dawn, his supporters were exhausted, their voices hoarse from arguing and protesting where they thought irregularities had occurred. When the final tally came, the margin of victory was razor thin. He had won, but by such a small number of votes that the result felt less like a triumph than a warning. His enemies had been close enough to taste victory. They would not forget that. He, the former village boy, had slipped through a crack in the wall. Now, the men who had built that wall would be watching him with new attention. His time at the hospital ended with a mixture of sorrow and resolve. Patients cried when he told them he could no longer be their doctor. Some begged him to stay, saying politics was dirty and dangerous, that he was too good a man for such things. He understood their fear, but he also knew something they did not. The dirtiness of politics was exactly why people like him needed to enter it. Leaving the hospital felt like stepping off a moving train. The familiar rhythm of ward rounds and diagnostics disappeared overnight. In its place came committee meetings, strategy sessions, and long hours in offices where the air was thick not with illness, but with ambition. In the Eastern legislature, he was at first just another new member with a fresh face and more energy than influence. The chamber crackled with regional rivalries, ideological differences, and the cautious presence of colonial officials who still watched. From the sidelines, their formal authority intact, but their grip weakened. Older politicians spoke in long, winding sentences, referencing events and alliances that predated his involvement. He listened, learned, and waited. But he did not wait passively. On issues related to health and rural development, he became known as a persistent voice, the young member who kept reminding the House that statistics on paper represented real people in villages. The rivalry with Chike in this phase became subtler but no less intense. While Michael fought for legislation in the regional assembly, Chike advanced in the administrative service, moving into positions where he handled files that affected funding and implementation. They were no longer opponents in a single election. They were two men climbing parallel ladders on either side of the same wall. When funds approved in the legislature were mysteriously delayed or misdirected in execution, Michael did not need anyone to tell. Him whose desk they might have passed through, once at a reception after a constitutional conference, they found themselves standing side by side, glasses in hand. "You see, Okpara," Chiki said quietly, eyes on the crowd, "you shout in the House and the newspapers quote you. I move a pen in an office and whole projects stop or start. Tell me, who really holds power?" It was not a boast, it was a challenge. Yet history had its own timetable, one that neither man controlled. As the 1950s moved forward, Nigeria's political structure shifted like a restless sleeper. New constitutions were introduced, granting regions greater autonomy. Parties formed alliances, broke them, and formed new ones overnight. In the eastern region, leaders grew increasingly aware that they needed a face for their aspirations, a younger man who could appeal to both the rural poor and the emerging urban class, someone educated yet rooted in village realities. In meeting after meeting, Michael's name began to surface, sometimes as a suggestion, sometimes as a warning. The real acceleration came when national politics collided with regional ambitions. As independence drew closer, the question of who would lead each region took on a fierce urgency. No one wanted to enter the new era with weak, divided leadership. In private, some party elders worried that the charismatic older figures who had led protests and strikes might not have the administrative discipline needed to run a complex regional government. Behind closed doors, they started looking for someone different, a bridge between the world of fiery speeches and the world of meticulous planning. That search brought them, again and again, back to the quiet doctor-turned-politician who kept talking about farms and clinics instead of simply trading insults with opponents. But elevating him would not be simple. Ambition is not limited to the young. There were men who had spent 20 years in politics, who had been jailed, beaten, and mocked for the nationalist cause. To ask them to step aside for a man barely out of his 20s was like asking a warrior to hand his sword to a boy. The internal struggle that followed was one of the most intense of his life, and most of it happened away from cameras and newspapers. Nights were spent in cramped rooms where party leaders argued until sweat dripped from their faces. Some accused Michael of being too close to foreign ideas because of his medical training. Others suspected that his focus on agriculture and health meant he did not understand the hard arithmetic of power, patronage, alliances, the management of egos. Through it all, he sat, listened, and spoke when necessary, never raising his voice more than needed, never forgetting that the clock was ticking. Constitutional deadlines for forming new governments did not care about hurt feelings. In the midst of this delicate dance, a shock arrived that no one had fully anticipated. A key figure in the regional hierarchy received an offer to move to a national position, opening a sudden gap in the chain of leadership. The vacuum was dangerous. If the wrong person filled it, the region could be dragged into endless factional fights just as independence was dawning. Some saw disaster, others saw opportunity. A small, determined group of younger politicians moved quickly, pressing Michael's name as the solution. He is not a mere speaker, one argued. He can plan, he understands figures, he understands farms, and he has something most of us do not, time. He can lead for years, not months. But the opposition within his own camp was fierce. One senior politician, his voice shaking with anger, shouted in a smoky room, "You want to hand this region to a boy who still smells of hospitals? Did he march when we marched? Did he bleed when we bled?" Michael sat through that outburst without flinching. When the man finished, he simply said, "You bled so that people like me could stand here now and use what we have learned to make. Sure, our people do not bleed again in hospitals and fields. If you keep all the power among yourselves until you die, what was the point?" And the argument did not win everyone over, but it shifted something. Slowly, grudgingly, the older guard began to consider that perhaps their greatest legacy would not be holding office until they were carried out, but handing it over to someone who could carry the work forward. Deals were made. Promises were sealed with handshakes that felt more like arm wrestling. And all the while, the date for forming the new government loomed closer. If they failed to present a united front, rival parties and even the central authorities could exploit the weakness. The final decision came down, as such decisions often do, in a way that seemed sudden to the outside world, but had been prepared by 1,000 small conversations. In a closed-door meeting, after hours of negotiation, Michael was chosen to lead the regional government. Word spread quickly. The doctor from Michael Okpara, the boy who had studied under a sputtering lamp, was now, in effect, the man. At the helm of one of Nigeria's most important regions, he would control budgets that his father could not have imagined, direct policies affecting millions of lives, and negotiate with men who had once looked through him as if he were barely there. When the announcement became public, reactions were mixed. Some greeted it with hope, seeing in his youth and background a promise of change. Others dismissed him as a temporary experiment. In the administrative halls where Cheeky and his colleagues worked, the news caused a different kind of stir. Overnight, the balance shifted. Files that once passed quietly from desk to desk now bore the name of a man who had been, until recently, just another determined voice in the assembly. In a small, telling moment, Cheeky stood at his window, watching as a new official car pulled into the compound, its paint gleaming in the sun. He did not need anyone to point out whose car it was. For Michael, the day he took office was both climax and beginning. Hands shook, cameras flashed. He repeated oaths with a steady voice, aware that each word bound him not only legally but morally to a future he could not yet see clearly. As he looked out over the crowd, he saw not just the party faithful and the dignitaries, but glimpses of faces from his past. A teacher, his patient gaze, a mother's grief, a child's still body on a hospital bed. The journey from the mudhouse to the seat of power had taken less than half a lifetime, yet the road ahead, he sensed, would be even more dangerous. Independence for Nigeria was now no longer an abstraction. It had a date circled on calendars, it had speeches drafted and flags sewn. The British would leave, that much was certain. What was not certain was whether the structures he now controlled would be strong enough to withstand the storms that were coming. Ethnic tensions, economic challenges, the clashing ambitions of men in Lagos and London, and always the quiet, relentless pull of poverty in the villages. He had raced against exam deadlines and nomination cutoffs. Now, he faced the most unforgiving countdown of all. A few short years to transform a region before history's gaze shifted from the colonizers to its own sons. And among those watching in offices and back rooms was a rival who knew him better than many allies did. A man who understood that. The boy who had once been content to win by a single point now held the power to redraw the scoreboard entirely. On the morning they handed him the keys to power, the lights went out. Not metaphorically. In the brand new government building, with flags still smelling of fresh dye and clerks whispering about the young premier, the ceiling fans shuddered to a stop. Files froze mid-stamp. The corridor fell into an uneasy silence, broken only by the thin wheeze of a dying generator somewhere below. One floor up, in an office that still smelled of paint, Michael Okpara stood over his first regional budget and watched the room sink into semi-darkness. It was like the country itself had flickered. Someone rushed in, apologizing, promising that the power would return in a few minutes. But in that heavy pause, staring at columns of figures that did not add up to the dreams inside his head, he understood something. Brutal. Power. Real power was not in the title he had just taken. It was in whether he could keep the lights on, literally and figuratively, for millions of people who had never heard of a premier until the newspapers taught them the word. The Treasury report in front of him was a slap. The Eastern region's revenues were smaller than the speeches made them sound. Debt from old projects sat like hidden landmines. The British were already planning their exit. Grants and technical aid came with expiry dates and sharp conditions. Civil servants, some loyal, some resentful, some quietly allergic to change, controlled the pipes through which every penny had to flow. At the top of one memo, in neat, precise handwriting, was a name he recognized like a scar. Chike. He had not seen that signature on paper before, only on school exam lists and administrative postings. Now it sat on a crucial document from the central government in Lagos, explaining in bureaucratic language why the Eastern region's requested development funds would be temporarily delayed pending further clarification. On the margin, some unknown hand had added in pencil a sentence that made his jaw tighten. Request considered ambitious in light of current national priorities? Ambitious. That was what they called it when a poor region asked for enough money to drag itself out of the mud. He had campaigned on one central promise: to make the Eastern region a place where a child did not have to choose between farm work and school, where a mother did not have to sell her last goat to buy medicine, where a young man did not have to board a lorry to Lagos to find work. He had told farmers that their land could yield more than hunger. He had told students that their brains could build factories, not just write petitions. Now, staring at a table full of red ink, he felt the weight of time pressing on his chest. He had, at best, one election cycle to prove that his promises were more than slogans. 4, maybe 5 years before voters would decide whether the doctor had been a madman or a visionary. 4 or 5 budgets. 4 or 5 planting seasons. A handful of rainy seasons to turn words into concrete roads, cooperatives, factories, schools. He did not sleep much in those first months. Days began before dawn with thick tea and stacks of files. They ended long after midnight, when his aides could barely keep their eyes open, but he was still hunched over maps of the region, drawing arrows from village names to proposed farm settlements, from rivers to potential dam sites. On some nights, the only sound in the building at 2 in the morning was his pen scratching over paper and the distant barking of dogs in the city outside. His plan was both simple and audacious. If the region was mostly rural, then the countryside would be his battlefield. He would not ask farmers to abandon their land for crowded cities. He would bring development to the farms themselves. Farm settlements, modern villages carved out with surveyed plots, access roads, irrigation where possible, and shared facilities, would become the backbone of a new economy. Around them, industries would rise. Processing plants, textile mills, factories that could turn raw produce into finished goods. In a single sentence, he explained it to skeptical colleagues. We will stop exporting our poverty and start exporting our products. The first time he visited a proposed farm settlement site, the air was thick with the smell of cut bush and diesel. Bulldozers, monsters to villagers who had never seen such machines, growled as they tore through the undergrowth. Smoke and dust hung in the air. Standing on a ridge, boots sinking slightly into red earth, he watched the land open up in raw strips, like a surgeon making an incision for a risky operation. Some of the elders who had come to witness the ceremony looked uneasy. Land to them was not just soil. It was memory, burial ground, lineage. They pulled him aside after the speeches, voices lowered. "Premier, we have seen white men clear land and leave empty promises behind," one said. "No, what will remain when you leave office? Bush that no longer grows the way it did?" He did not answer with tables or percentages. He walked them toward the cleared ground and knelt, scooping up a handful of soil. "Give me 5 planting seasons," he said quietly. "If this land does not feed more children than it does now, if it does not send more of your sons and daughters to school, then you may say I failed you. But if we do nothing, your grandchildren will be kneeling on the same spot, wondering why their fathers were too afraid to try. 5 seasons. It sounded generous when he said it aloud. Inside, it felt like a countdown. As projects multiplied, farm settlements, industrial estates, new schools, feeder roads, so did the enemies. The first blow came not from opposition benches, but from inside the machinery he was trying to drive. A confidential report reached him about a proposed oil mill project. Costs had been inflated. Contractors with no experience had been shortlisted. Someone, somewhere between his office and the smallest department, had decided that this new eastern region would be a buffet. He exploded. In a closed meeting, with files spread out like a crime scene, he confronted senior civil servants who had been in the service since before he entered secondary school. Some were old enough to be his father. Their faces hardened as he raised his voice, abandoning the careful politeness he usually carried like a shield. "If you think this government is a shop where you come to collect your share," he said, stabbing a finger at a page, "you are in the wrong building. You may be used to politicians who close their eyes while you eat. I am not hungry for those crumbs. I did not leave a hospital to watch you bleed this region dry through contracts." After that day, rumors began to spread. The new premier was difficult. He did not understand how things are done. Some admired his stubbornness. Others wrote it off as youth. In offices where he never set foot, men sat around wooden tables, whispering that he would either learn to bend or break. In Lagos, the whispers took on another form. One humid afternoon in a federal ministry house where the walls still carried the faint smell of British Polish, Chiki sat with a small group of senior officials. A file lay open on the table, the Eastern region's latest request for increased development funds. At the back of the file was a note from a British advisor, cautioning that Premier Okpara's plans, while energetic, may outrun the region's financial capacity and create unmanageable expectations. "Unmanageable expectations," someone chuckled, tapping ash into an overfull tray. "That is what politicians create when they promise villages electricity before they have fixed their own cities." Cheek said nothing at first. He flipped through the pages, pausing at graphs, reading the descriptions of farm settlements and industrial estates. The ambition was unmistakable. So was the political risk. If these projects succeeded, the eastern region could become an economic powerhouse. If they failed, the backlash would be volcanic. "Gentlemen," he said finally, closing the file, "we have to be careful. We cannot deny every request. That would look vindictive. But we must ensure that allocations reflect national balance. The North has its needs. The West has its crisis. And your East has a man who wants to build a new world in 5 years," someone cut in dryly. Cheeky smiled thinly. "I know him," he said. "If you give him enough rope, he will try to pull the sun closer. The question is whether the rope snaps or whether he burns us all." The decision they reached that day was elegant in its cruelty. Partial approvals, delayed disbursements, funding released in tranches, too small to match the tempo of Okpara's plans. It would keep the eastern region moving, but always a step behind its own ambitions. On the ground, the effect was immediate. Concrete ran out midway through construction. Bulldozers stood idle. rust beginning to bite at their joints. At one farm settlement, a half-completed processing plant towered over fields that had already begun to yield crops with nowhere to go. Farmers watched their produce rot faster than the government could move. The opposition pounced. In the assembly, an older member, with a voice trained over decades of protests, thundered, "You see what happens when you run ahead of your shadow? The premier wants to build factories in the forest, while people in the town still drink from muddy streams. He is turning this region into one giant experiment, and we are the rats." The motion of no confidence that followed was the most dangerous political moment of Michael's career. The debate dragged on for hours, tempers flaring, the air in the chamber thick with heat and accusation. Outside, crowds gathered, not entirely sure of parliamentary procedures, but certain that something important and possibly explosive was happening. He listened to the attacks, hands folded, expression unreadable. When his turn finally came, he did not defend himself with excuses about delayed funds or uncooperative civil servants. He told a story. He spoke of a village he had visited during the last planting season, where an old woman had shown him her hands, twisted by years of farm work, knuckles swollen, palms thick with calluses. She had asked him one question: "Will my grandchildren ever touch a machine that makes this work easier? Or will they carry hoes until their backs break like mine?" "I could have told her," he said now, voice steady, "that we will wait until every road is perfect, every treasury is full, until the British leave with a signed guarantee that nothing will go wrong. I could have said, we will do nothing until we can do everything. Instead, I told her we would begin, that some of us would risk being called foolish, so that her grandchildren might one day laugh at how we used to farm like this." Silence fell for a long moment. Then he did something that startled even his allies. He pulled out the latest treasury figures and placed them on the table for all to see. "This is how much we have," he said. "It is not enough. It may never be enough. But you must decide tonight whether you want a government that measures every step so carefully that it forgets to move, or one that moves knowing it might stumble but refusing to crawl. If you think my mistakes are greater than my vision, remove me. Do it now. Let us not pretend." The vote was close, but he survived. The no-confidence motion failed by a margin that left him feeling less victorious than sobered. A few more missteps, a few more rotting harvests, and the balance could easily tip. Outside the chamber, as the crowd poured into the night, someone pushed through the throng toward him. It was a messenger from Lagos, dusty from travel, clutching a sealed envelope. "Federal communication, urgent." He opened it in the back of his car, eyes scanning the typed lines. The central government, citing overall fiscal strain and the need for national cohesion, was further revising revenue allocations. The East would receive less than expected, much less. For a moment, the sound of rejoicing outside became strangely distant, as if muffled by water. He felt the shape of the coming years crystallize with awful clarity. He would have to build more with less, faster than anyone thought possible, under the gaze of enemies who wanted him to fail, and allies who would turn on him the moment hope turned sour. The countdown reset harsher than before. Independence came like a festival and a funeral wrapped into one. Flags rose, anthems were sung, fireworks exploded against the night sky over Lagos. In Enugu, people danced in the streets, drumming until their palms hurt, women tying new wrappers that shimmered in the light of kerosene lamps. Somewhere in the throng, a child looked up at the new green-white-green flag and believed, with the absolute certainty of youth, that everything would change. In his office, on the night Nigeria became independent, Michael stood by the window, the distant echo of celebrations floating up to him. On his desk sat 3 files that could not wait for history: an urgent report about a failing cooperative, a briefing on industrial development plans, and a confidential memo warning of ethnic tensions in the North that were beginning to seep into national politics like a slow poison. The clock on the wall clicked loudly. He allowed himself a few minutes to watch fireworks explode over the hills, brief flowers of light blooming and dying against the dark. Then he went back to his desk. The British had finally removed their hands from the steering wheel. Now, if the car veered into a ditch, there would be no one else to blame. The years that followed were a paradox. On the one hand, the eastern region under his leadership became a case study in what could be done when ambition met disciplined planning. New roads laced through countryside that had once been accessible only by narrow footpaths. Industrial estates buzzed with machines that turned cocoa, palm produce, and other raw materials into products stamped with local names. Farm settlements, imperfect and struggling but alive, dotted the map. Visitors from other parts of Africa came to see this economic miracle. They toured factories where young men who would once have boarded lorries to Lagos now operated machinery with practiced confidence. They visited schools built within walking distance of villages that had never seen a classroom. They watched as farmers attended training sessions on improved methods, listening with a mixture of skepticism and hope. But behind each success story was a ledger of strain. Every new project meant another late-night wrestling with figures, another confrontation with civil servants who warned of overextension. In another round of tense negotiation with Lagos, federal politics grew more toxic. The census became a battlefield of numbers, each region fighting over head counts, because population translated into seats, seats into power, power into money. The Western region erupted into crisis, scenes of violence playing across newspapers like a warning from the future. In that atmosphere, even success became suspicious. Opponents accused him of favoring certain areas over others. He builds here because they vote for him, they muttered. Pamphlets appeared accusing his government of using regional resources to create a personal political machine. In private, foreign advisors worried that his model, state-driven, ambitious, unapologetically interventionist, would encourage other regions to demand similar support, stretching the young nation's finances thin. One evening, in a quiet corner of a Lagos hotel after a tense national conference, he ran into Chiki again. They had both aged in ways the mirror could not fully capture. The lines on their faces were less from time than from responsibility. "You've been busy," Cheek said, swirling the drink in his glass. "People in London talk about your region like it's a laboratory." "You helped make it one," Michael replied, not bothering to hide the slight edge in his voice. "With your delayed funds and revised allocations," Cheek shrugged. "I do not control everything. You know that? Besides, you underestimate what your success does to the rest of us. If the East shines too brightly, others will complain that we are tilting the country in your favor. There are balances to maintain." "Balances?" Michael snapped, leaning forward. "Is that what you call it when a farmer watches his crops rot because a processing plant stands half-finished? When a child leaves school because her fees cannot be paid after her father's cooperative collapses under the weight of bureaucratic delays?" There was a pause. The murmur of the hotel bar hummed around them. "Listen," Cheek said more quietly. "You think our rivalry is about old exam scores and regional pride? It's not. It's about whether this country survives its own contradictions. You are pushing your region to run a marathon at sprint speed. Others are crawling. Do you think that gap can widen forever without something breaking?" He left before Michael could answer. In the months that followed, that question haunted him more than he cared to admit. He saw the gap widening with his own eyes on each trip to Lagos. Glittering federal offices full of polished talk, then the rough, noisy, determined construction sites back home. He sensed the jealousy of other regions, the muttered accusations that the East thought itself too clever by half. He read reports of soldiers grumbling in distant barracks, of politicians plotting in smoke-filled rooms, of newspapers sharpening their words like knives. Still, the work continued. It had to. Even as clouds gathered, fields needed planting, factories needed approvals, schools needed teachers. The young men on farm settlements did not speak in the language of constitutional crises. They talked about fertilizer and market prices. The mothers at new clinics did not care about federal allocations. They watched the nurse's hand as she weighed their babies. That, more than anything, kept him moving. The knowledge that for most people, politics was not speeches and motions. It was whether food appeared on the table and medicine appeared on the shelf. The final twist came with almost no warning, and yet, in retrospect, 1,000 clues. Elections grew more tense, more fraught with accusations of rigging and intimidation. Newspapers began to carry words like breakdown, crisis, standoff, with an unsettling regularity. In the North, violence flared against people from other regions. Bodies appeared where arguments had once sufficed. Rumors of plots, civilian, military, sometimes both, circulated like a fever. One cold dawn in January, he was woken by urgent knocking on his door. An aide stood there, eyes wide in a way that told him this was not about a late report or a delayed payment. "There are reports of a coup," the aide said, voice shaking. "Soldiers have moved in Lagos. Some leaders," he hesitated, swallowing, "some leaders are already dead." The words fell like stones. In the hours that followed, telephones crackled with half-confirmed news. Names of national figures, some allies, some rivals, were whispered in tones usually reserved for funerals. Units of the army were on the move. Everywhere, rumors raced faster than facts. In his office, the same one where the lights had failed on his first morning, he found himself staring at maps again. Not of farm settlements this time, but of strategic routes, possible flashpoints, areas where panic might erupt. Advisors begged him to slip away quietly, to take a car and disappear into the countryside until the situation clarified. He looked at the files on his desk. Contracts unsigned, projects midstream, plans for the next planting season half-formed. Behind each sheet of paper lay thousands of lives woven into their success or failure. "I cannot run like a thief," he said quietly. "If this house is to fall, I will be inside it, trying to hold the roof." But as evening approached and the reports grew darker, troops closer, radio announcements more ominous, he understood that the era He had poured his youth into was ending, whether he acknowledged it or not. The question was no longer whether he would keep the lights on, but whether there would be a building left to wire. The night settled over the city, thick and oppressive. Somewhere in the distance, a burst of gunfire cracked the air, then another. Car engines roared down streets that were usually calm at that hour. Voices carried, urgent and afraid. Then it came. A violent pounding at the gate, fists and rifle butts striking metal, with a rhythm that felt like the beating of an enormous, merciless heart. Time, which had ruled his life in election cycles and planning seasons, shrank to a single command. Decide. Stay seated behind the desk he had fought so hard to reach, or stand up and walk into whatever waited beyond that door. The countdown that had begun years earlier, in a hospital ward, in a village school, in a budget meeting under failing lights, had reached 0. They didn't kick the door in. They did something colder. The pounding stopped, and for a heartbeat the house held its breath. Then the gate creaked open, metal protesting softly, and boots began to crunch across the gravel. No shouting, no wild threats, just disciplined footsteps and the click of safeties being eased off. When the knock finally came at his office door, it was almost polite. "Premier," a young officer said when he entered, saluting with a hand that trembled only slightly. The barrel of his rifle gleamed under the ceiling light. "By order of the new government, you are requested to come with us. For your own safety, requested." Behind the officer, 2 soldiers stood with their backs to the wall, eyes scanning the room in short, sharp movements. The clock above Michael's desk ticked loudly, slicing the moment into brittle pieces. The files he had been reading, budgets, project reports, lists of names and villages, lay open like interrupted prayers. "How long do I have?" he asked. The officer looked confused. "Sir, how long?" Michael repeated, "before we leave?" The man checked his watch, as if they were discussing a train schedule, not the end of an era. 10 minutes, sir. We have other places to secure. 10 minutes to decide what to take from a life built over decades." He did not reach for money. He did not reach for medals or photographs. He picked up 3 things: a well-worn notebook full of figures and ideas, a folded map of the eastern region with pencil marks where new roads and farm settlements lay, and a single fountain pen, the one he had used on the night the region's self-government was declared. On the drive away from the government house, the city moved past the window in disconnected flashes. A woman drawing water at a public tap he had ordered built. A lorry loaded with produce heading toward a market his policies had expanded. A school compound where children chased each other under a fading signboard that still carried his government's logo. It struck him with almost physical force. None of those people knew that, as far as power was concerned, he had just ceased to exist. They took him to a barracks on the outskirts of town, a place where the air smelled of oil and sweat, and the metallic tang of fear. They searched him carefully, too carefully for someone being protected, and placed him in a small room with a narrow bed, a tiny desk, and a barred window that admitted more mosquitoes than breeze. The officer who had escorted him hesitated at the door. "Sir," he said quietly, "for what it's worth, my father got land in one of your farm settlements. He says it changed our family. I am sorry about this." Michael studied the young man's face, searching for answers that weren't there. "This will not be forever," the officer added, perhaps to comfort himself. No sentence is as terrifying as the one with no duration. Days in detention blurred at the edges but remained sharp at the center. Sharp the first time he heard distant gunfire and realized decisions were being made with bullets instead of ballots. Sharp when the radio, his only link to the country outside his barred window, crackled with news of a counter-coup and reprisals. Names he knew, colleagues, rivals, men he had argued with in Parliament and over budget tables, were mentioned in quick, clipped tones. Some were removed, some were lost. Behind each euphemism, a body. He tried to keep track of his projects through scraps of information. A guard mentioned that soldiers had moved into one of the farm settlements, using the training halls as makeshift barracks. An orderly complained that his brother, a clerk in a ministry, had been ordered to review all contracts from the previous civilian administration. Review. In plain language, undo. One evening, as the sun bled through the bars in long orange lines, the door opened and a new detainee was pushed in. He stumbled, caught himself on the bed, then straightened slowly, blinking as his eyes adjusted. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Cheeky looked thinner, the edges of his authority stripped away with his uniform. The sharp suit was gone, replaced by prison clothes that hung awkwardly on his frame. The careful parting in his hair had been defeated by dust and sweat. "So," he said finally with a bitter twist of his mouth, "it seems the rope snapped for both of us." It was a twist that would have seemed too neat if it weren't so cruel. The rival who had once controlled the flow of funds from Lagos, who had signed memos that delayed his projects and spoke of national balance, now lay on the same narrow mattress. a prisoner of the same guns. They did not even bother to pretend it was about ideology, Cheeky continued, sinking onto the bed. One speech on the radio, and they announced that all politicians, civilian or not, are the problem. We are all merged into one convenient enemy. He laughed, the sound dry and hollow. We spent years arguing over percentages and policy, he said. And all the while there were men polishing boots in barracks, polishing bullets, polishing grievances. Michael sat on the chair opposite him. Tell me, he said, was it worth it? The letters you wrote, the delays, the warnings about unmanageable expectations? Did it make the country safer from this? Silence stretched between them, thick as smoke. Cheeky finally looked up. I thought, he said slowly, that if we moved cautiously enough, if we did not let any region run too far ahead, we could keep the whole fragile thing together, that we had time to negotiate, to adjust, to manage. I was wrong about the timeline, Michael. That is my crime. I thought we had decades, we had years, we had months, we had less than we imagined. Outside, the barracks loudspeaker crackled as someone shouted orders. Inside, two men who had once measured their days in the rise and fall of budgets now measured them by the rhythm of guards' footsteps and the blunt thud of lockbolts. News from outside grew more frantic. Massacres in the north, refugees pouring into the east, bringing stories so horrific they sounded like nightmares whispered in fever. Trains arriving with blood on the floors, lorries carrying more bodies than passengers, people fleeing with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the scars on their minds. The eastern region, his region, became a pressured chamber, its population swollen with the displaced, its anger rising like heat in a closed room. In that furnace, the word secession stopped being an abstraction and started to sound, to many, like survival. He was no longer premier. Military administrators and new leaders now decided the course of history. He watched from the sidelines, released from detention only to find himself caged by circumstance. A man whose political time had run out just as his region stepped toward the most dangerous cliff in its history. When Biafra was declared, flags changed overnight, signboards repainted, maps redrawn. Young men who had trained in his farm settlements now carried rifles instead of hoes. Roads he had fought to build were suddenly strategic supply lines. Targets on aerial bombing maps, he moved between safe houses and temporary accommodations, his notebook of economic plans now an artifact from another universe. At night, the glow on the horizon came not from newly electrified villages, but from burning depots and towns under attack. The cruelest sight came in the form of something he had once dreamed of. A factory, lit at night, humming with activity. Only now, the workers inside were dismantling machines, not operating them. Unscrewing bolts, loading equipment onto trucks, trying to move what they could deeper into rebel territory before federal troops advanced. Where he had envisioned expansion lines, there were now evacuation lists. He had once given himself 5 planting seasons to transform the countryside. War reduced the horizon of planning to days. How many days until the next air raid? How many hours until the road was cut? How many minutes until the next convoy left with or without you? Every decision became a race against a clock no one could see. Offers came, quiet and dangerous. Take a public role in the new order. Lend your reputation to the Biafran cause. Become the civilian face of a desperate war. It would have been a chance to step back onto a stage he knew intimately, to feel again the weight of responsibility and the strange, bitter exhilaration of leadership in crisis. He refused. Not because he believed the East should return meekly to a Nigeria that had watched its people slaughtered, but because he knew that, tying his name to a war whose outcome was uncertain, and whose methods he could not control, would turn his entire life's work into a footnote of rebellion in the history books of whichever side won. I will feed people, he told those who tried to persuade him. I will advise quietly where I can, but I will not sign my name to decisions made with guns pointed over our heads. In the end, war answered the question that politics could not. When Biafra fell, the surrender was both public and deeply private. On the radio, formal statements spoke of no victor, no vanquished. On the ground, people wandered through the wreckage of towns and farms and factories, trying to decide what counted as victory when one side had starved and the other had bled. For men like Michael, there was no clear path back to public life. The military regimes that followed treated old politicians like dangerous relics, too respected to be entirely crushed, too independent to be allowed near power. He slipped into exile, first temporarily, then as the months lengthened into years. Dublin, London. Hotel rooms with generic artwork and generic curtains. Apartments where the view from the window was not the red earth of home, but gray pavements slick with rain. He became a man divided by time zones. In the mornings, he navigated foreign streets, learning how to buy groceries in currencies that still felt like play money in his hands. In the evenings, he huddled around radios, chasing Nigerian broadcasts that faded in and out through static, each crackle and pause, a reminder that he was listening across thousands of miles and a chasm of history. Sometimes in Irish drizzle, he would stand at the edge of a field and stare at stubborn green crops pushing through the soil, and his fingers would itch with the familiar urge to plan irrigation, access roads, storage facilities. He would catch himself mentally redesigning land he had no authority over and no obligation to transform. It was like being haunted by your own instincts. Occasionally, letters arrived from home. Some were filled with cautious praise. People still remember, former colleagues wrote. When the new rulers talk about agriculture, they still mention your farm settlements. When they talk about regional development, they cannot avoid your name. Others were bitter. They use your achievements as a benchmark, one letter sneered. But they will not let you near the machinery. It is like listening to someone praise a building while quietly pulling out its foundations. The most unexpected letter came with an address in the corner that made him blink. It was from Chike. He had vanished during the war. Swallowed by the chaos of coups and counter-coups, rumors placed him everywhere and nowhere. Dead, imprisoned, rehabilitated, quietly advising the very regimes that had overthrown both their worlds. Now, in careful handwriting, he filled several pages with something that was not quite apology and not quite justification. I have learned, Chike wrote, that there are worse things than being called ambitious. There is being called irrelevant. They use our old arguments as examples of civilian decadence. They say, look how these men wasted time on debates, while soldiers watched the country slide toward chaos. They do not understand that those debates were the only thing standing between us and the chaos they now claim to control. He spoke of meetings in barracks, of decisions made in rooms where road networks and school budgets were discussed in the same tone as troop deployments. He wrote of a generation of officers who could recite the range of artillery, but not the yield of a palm plantation. Then came the sentence that caught in Michael's chest like a hook. I used to measure success by whether I could slow you down, Chike admitted. Now I measure it by whether anyone still believes the kind of speed you once demanded is possible. He ended with a question. Will you come back? There's talk of amnesty, of normalization. I do not know how long the window will stay open. Men in uniform are generous only when it costs them nothing. There it was again, the clock. He was older now. The years in exile had drawn lines on his face that no amount of rest could erase. He moved more slowly. The chest pains that came after climbing stairs lingered longer than they used to. Doctors spoke in phrases like risk management and avoid unnecessary stress. He knew, with the precision of a man trained in medicine and seasoned in politics, that his body no longer had the reserves for the kind of battles that had once defined him. He also knew that if he died abroad, in some anonymous hospital ward, the story would be too simple. A former premier, cut down by history, fading in a foreign bed. He wanted to die on his own soil. So he returned. The air that greeted him off the plane was thicker than he remembered, full of dust and exhaust, and the distant scent of wood smoke. At the airport, there were no brass bands, no official delegations, just a small group of old comrades and younger relatives, faces creased by relief and complicated by the awareness that, in the eyes of the current rulers, this homecoming was at best tolerated, not celebrated. On the drive through familiar terrain, he saw his past and his present collide in strange combinations. There, a stretch of road he had fought to fund, still holding, its surface rough but serviceable, lorries thundering over it with loads of produce. Here, a farm settlement signboard, letters faded, some of the original buildings crumbling, but the fields around it still green with crops. In one town, he insisted they stop. He walked slowly, supported on one side by a cane and on the other by a former aide who had somehow survived coups, war, and purges with his spirit intact. Children stared at the old man in plain clothes, not recognizing the face that had once appeared on posters and in newspaper columns. A woman emerged from a nearby shop, wiping her hands on her wrapper. She squinted, then gasped. "Doctor!" she cried, using the title he had almost forgotten people once used freely. "Doctor, you're back!" she called others. In minutes, he was surrounded by villagers who remembered the clinics he had opened, the school that had replaced a mud hut, the cooperative that had allowed them to buy fertilizer as a group instead of selling their goats one by one. Their gratitude was a balm, but their stories were also knives. "Since you left," one farmer said, "they have changed this program and that scheme. They talk plenty, but—" He trailed off, shrugging toward a half-finished structure nearby, rebar protruding into the sky like rusting fingers. There was a part of Michael that wanted to hurl himself back into the fray, to start drafting memos, calling meetings, mapping new projects. But the political reality was as hard as the cane beneath his hand. The men who ran the country preferred retired politicians to stay retired. A harmless elder statesman was useful. A returning strategist with a track record of turning plans into reality was not. So he did something that seemed, to those who had only known him as premier, almost small. He went back to the land, not as a romantic gesture, but as a disciplined project. He invested in farming and business, applying on a modest scale the same principles he had once deployed region-wide. Plan carefully. I reinvest profits, treat workers as partners rather than expendable hands. Look beyond the next harvest. In the mornings, you could find him walking among rows of crops, stooping to examine leaves for signs of disease, asking managers about yields and market prices. He insisted on proper bookkeeping, on simple but effective maintenance schedules, on training younger people to run operations without waiting for orders from above. Time does not respect nostalgia, he told a group of restless youths one day when they came seeking advice on politics but stayed to listen to him talk about agronomy. If you want to honor what we did, do not repeat our speeches, improve our methods. News of his quiet work spread in ripples. Journalists came, sniffing for bitterness, hoping to coax out denunciations of the regimes that had sidelined him. He disappointed them by refusing to reduce his life to grievances. I made my case when I had the platform, he would say. The record is there. Compare what we did then to what you have now. That is enough argument. But in private, with close friends, he sometimes let the mask slip. They did not defeat my ideas with better ideas, he said once, his voice low. They pushed them aside with force, with fatigue, with time. That makes the loss heavier, not lighter. His rivalry with Cheek entered its final, strangest phase. They met again, older men now, in a quiet corner of a reception where younger officials orbited around them like nervous satellites. There was no talk of memos or percentages, no jabs about ambition or restraint. They name you, Cheek said with a faint smile, when they talk about the good old days. And you? Michael asked. That they do not name me at all, he replied. That is my punishment, not denunciation. Erasure. It was an unexpected twist in a story that had once been driven by head-to-head competition. The man who had tried to slow him for the sake of the national balance was the one history threatened to forget. The man who had once been accused of dangerous ambition was becoming a benchmark. Perhaps, Michael said, our greatest mistake was thinking we were rivals in anything but time. We thought we were competing against each other. We were both competing against a clock we did not set. The last race he ran was against his own body. Illness crept up on him the way political trouble once had. Quietly at first, then all at once. He grew tired more easily. The cane became not just a support, but a necessity. Trips to Europe, once for conferences and negotiations, were now for tests and treatments, sterile rooms and hushed consultations. In a London hospital, far from the sun-baked fields he had come to love again, doctors spoke in terms of probabilities. He listened with the detached calm of a man who had once had to quantify risk for millions. How long, he asked, as he had asked a young officer years before. This time the answer came with more qualifiers, more medical caveats. But its meaning was the same. Not long enough to finish everything you started. In his final weeks, he dictated letters rather than speeches. To his family, to a handful of protégés, to anyone he thought might still care about the difference between what had been and what could still be. He did not spend those letters settling scores. He spent them issuing challenges. Do not let them tell you that big plans are the problem, he wrote. The problem is when big plans are not matched by hard work and clean hands. If they say, we must be realistic, ask them whose reality they are protecting. The villagers or their own. He died on a cold December day in 1984, the kind of day when breath hangs in the air like ghosts. The official statements noted his positions, his dates of birth and death, his title as former premier. Some mentioned his agricultural policies. A few called him visionary. But the true measure of his legacy was written far from the obituaries. In a village he had once visited as a young doctor, an old woman sat on a wooden stool outside a concrete house with a corrugated roof. Her grandchildren did their homework inside, under an electric bulb, powered by a line that traced its way back to infrastructure he had set in motion decades earlier. When a neighbor asked if she had heard that the old premier had died, she nodded slowly. He was the one, she said, her voice soft but clear, who made us believe that our sons could be more than laborers, and our daughters more than wives. She gestured toward the house. Look, they say he is gone, but he is in this roof, in that light, in the road that brings my children home. Somewhere else, a civil servant leafed through an aging policy document, surprised at how detailed the old plans had been, how many modern buzzwords they had anticipated. A young politician preparing a campaign speech scribbled down a line about reviving the spirit of the eastern region under Michael Okpara, not fully understanding the weight of the name he was borrowing. And in a dusty classroom, a teacher pointed to a map and traced routes across the eastern landscape, talking about roads and farms, and industries that had once made the region the envy of others. A student, bored and curious in equal measure, wrote the unfamiliar name on the edge of his notebook. Michael Okpara. He would later search it, read fragments, discover that the man behind the name had died before he was born. He would learn that once, there had been a leader who tried to drag time forward, who treated budgets like weapons against poverty, who believed that development was not a favor but a right. He would not know the sound of boots on gravel or the feel of a countdown pressing against a man's ribs. But the light above his head would burn a little steadier because of choices made in rooms where the power sometimes failed and the future crept in through the cracks. The boy would close his notebook, the bulb would hum softly, and outside in the dark, a country would continue to wrestle with the same questions that had consumed Michael Okpara's life. How fast can you run without leaving others behind? How much can you build before the clock runs out? And when the lights go off, because they still do sometimes, who will be the one to stand up in the half-darkness, stare at the figures that do not add up and decide again to try?